Well, my friends, it finally frickin' happened. Yeah, on February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched decapitation strikes targeting Iranian leadership, which at the moment that I am making this here now on March 5th, 2026, in the early morning hours, appears to have had, well, remarkable success, taking out much of the leadership of the theocratic dictatorship, including the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei himself, who has ruled Iran for the last 40 years. And this all happened, mind you, in the span of less than 24 hours from the moment everything began. Dubbed Operation Epic Fury by the Pentagon, the strikes also took out Iran's defense minister and other officials in the first wave, as well as crippled most of Iran's anti-air defense capabilities. Of course, that is not to say that Iran did nothing and was completely helpless like Venezuela was. They have since retaliated with a barrage of missile strikes against Israel and US military outposts across the region, notably in Bahrain, UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, potentially drawing in other neutral powers in what could be a very grave miscalculation on the part of, well, the remaining Iranian leadership. Yeah, this whole thing is an absolute mess. Gulf states, encouraged by Donald Trump, are on the verge of ending their neutrality in the conflict against Iran, in reprisal for Tehran's repeated, and I quote, reckless and indiscriminate attacks, end quote, on their territory and infrastructure. And we are not talking like defense or military installations, things that would kind of make sense. We're talking five-star hotels and apartment blocks getting blown up. So now, the calls, led by the United Arab Emirates from inside the six-country Gulf Cooperation Council, are for the Arab states to act in self-defense against Iran. And if that should happen, this would be huge and unprecedented. This would be something that, considering previous desperate calls for peace and neutrality, would be a wild thing. But if it should happen, it would be a huge step for Gulf leaders, in effect, to side with Israel in a war that would determine the future shape of the Middle East. A war the likes of which has, again, not really been seen since the rise of ISIS in 2014 after the collapse of Syria, or, if you want to talk about it in more conventional terms, since 2003 with Iraq. In a video meeting of GCC foreign ministers on Sunday, March 1st, this is something that there was no real explicit reference to such a plan actually taking place, but it was stated in it that, quote, there was the option to respond to Iranian attacks, something that would be done to protect regional security and stability that remained on the table. Now, again, should that happen, if that happens, it would be a massive and sudden reversal of fortunes on the part of Iran. And when I say that, the reason is because for the last 2 years, Iran has expended huge amounts of diplomatic efforts to try and convince the Gulf states that it is Israel, not Iran, that is the chief destabilizing force in the region. But now much of that painstaking work that was done in the form of speeches, conferences, and diplomatic visits appears to have completely fallen apart in just a matter of, again, quite literally days. This is also extremely interesting coming off of the whole UAE video that I had done quite literally a few weeks ago at this point. But all that being said, it is here, my friends, that we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. As you know, on the History of Everything, we try to explore the history in the context of events that led up to the moments that we are talking about, and in this case, I am personally faced with a little bit of a conundrum. Namely the fact that in the past 12 months, I have already made a whopping 5 videos on Iran, addressing its water crisis 2 times as it worsened, why Iran hates the West, why its economy has been collapsing, and finally why the state has been physically, politically, and socially crumbling, and I mean that in the most literal sense, with the most recent protests resulting in literally tens of thousands of people getting killed as the regime fought to hold on to power successfully at the time in the last couple of months. Why are you crying below me? What do you want? Again, every time when the world burns, you want attention? Okay, hold on. Okay. Yes, I know. For those of you that have not met her, this is Moonbeam, this is my cat, and she loves it when the world burns. Sometimes I think you are the reason why every single time I travel, everything always goes to crap. Yes, needless to say here, my friends, I have covered Iran a lot, and so it would be horribly self-serving of me in the name of providing context to make yet another hour-long video where 40 minutes of that is the history of Iran since the early 1900s. I've done that a couple times because I've had to address varying different aspects, and I will not be doing that to you here. So I'm telling you who is watching this right now, if you want more context, a much deeper context about the issues that we are talking about here today that a lot of other channels are simply not giving, and I promise you, it is extremely valuable to know and very relevant to this video, I strongly encourage you to first check out my older videos because again, I have done a lot of them. But no, my friends, instead what we are going to do to understand the current conflict is that we need to address very quickly what has been happening in Iran for the last year. Not century, year. And more importantly, what happened in between the protests of early 2026 that were largely crushed by January 16th and the time the bombs began to drop on February 28th. Get ready, my friends. This is going to get quite messy. And I ask that you keep a cool head on your shoulders and understand that what I am doing right now is explaining why something happened. I'm not justifying it, I'm not celebrating it, I'm not shaming it, or anything in between. I have been called everything from a CIA shill to an anti-Trump, anti-American foreign agent, and none of these things are true, and by pissing off the extremes on the internet, I suppose that I guess I am doing something right. You know, so there's that. Oh, and also, before it is that I go any further here, I need to stress, if you don't want just the geopolitical history content that I do and you want pure history about any other kind of random things in history, then check out my History Hose channel, which is the History of Everything podcast that I do for Spotify and Apple. That is on there. So we're doing all episodes that are on that channel. You can find a link down in the description, and I really appreciate the support because the channel is starting out small and I'm hoping to grow it quite nicely. Also, support me on Patreon if you want additional content as well as ad-free episodes. Oh yeah, and also side note here, I know that every single time that I go and travel, the world decides to light itself on fire. If you want to be potentially part of that experience, you can join me in Greece or Croatia or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of trips here, and if you really want to travel with me this summer to Greece and Croatia, the spots for that are going to be expired in like 3 weeks now, I think at this point. It's like the last chance for people to get tickets to travel with me here this summer. So if you want to go on an adventure and learn some history, do that. And then we can potentially watch the world burn. Oh my God, this week has been absolutely insane. But either way, what it is that we need to do right now to begin is set the stage with Iran's current economic and political crisis. Again, we are only explaining what has been happening for the last year, even though the roots of this problem are significantly older. And I have addressed these before, but again, I already said that. So, okay, from the start here, Iran entered the year of 2025 already severely weakened. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, corruption, and the cost of financing proxy wars across the region had effectively hollowed out the economy. But 2025 also saw the crisis cross a threshold from being chronic to acute. It wasn't just a long-standing thing, it was something that became astronomically worse. First off on the list of factors for this crisis is the currency issue. The Iranian rial, which had been steadily declining, went into free fall that year. It halved in value between July of 2024 and March of 2025. On March 19th, 2025, the exchange rate would cross the symbolic barrier of 1,000,000 rials to $1, which made it, at the time, the least valuable currency in the world. And that says something considering we've talked about stuff with Venezuela here. The rial is worse, and it would only get worse. By December of 2025, it had plummeted further to 1.75 million rials per dollar, with the finance minister blaming the impact of Iran's recent war with Israel, which I will be mentioning here again in just a bit, but needless to say, oh my God, they sucked at economics. They really did. It's a mess. Again, go back and watch my older videos on this. Either way, though, as you can imagine, this inflation was absolutely terrible for just about everyone in the country. The IMF would estimate that consumer prices rose by 42.4% in 2025, following 32.5% in 2024. But other measures were even worse. Inflation would hit 48.6% by October of 2025, and food price inflation specifically would soar above 70%. By March of 2025, estimates had ranged that a quarter to more than half of Iranians were living below the poverty line. And that was March, mind you. We just already mentioned how bad things were getting in October, so that value was just getting significantly worse. It was not getting better. In October of 2025, the World Bank projected that Iran's economy was going to contract in both 2025 and 2026. Not even looking at the potential issue of the actual bombings or other things that were taking place. This is just on its own, it was crashing. and the annual inflation would continue to rise towards 60%. Oil exports, Iran's economic lifeline, began declining sharply, and the country's ability to access global financial markets remained crippled by sanctions. On top of all this, as I addressed in a previous video, was the increased efficacy of sanctions, the anti-shadow fleet operations, and of course the loss of Venezuela as a potential ally. Iran and Venezuela had maintained long-established economic ties to offset their respective sanctions, but the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by the United States in January of 2026 dealt a blow to this arrangement. It was unlikely that Iran's investments in Venezuela would be able to be recovered because, US courts simply wouldn't allow this, given Iran's own sanctioned status and its shadow fleet of oil tankers were rapidly being captured or grounded in ports, unable to fulfill their role as a lifeline, which meant that everything was effectively crashing and burning. By late 2025, Time Magazine, Euronews, and Al Monitor all reported that Iran was nearing economic collapse, and this is before the issue with Maduro. The economic crisis is something that was compounded by a devastating military confrontation with Israel in mid-2025, something that was referred to as the 12-Day War. This conflict would lead to massive military and strategic losses on Iran's part, destroying much of its conventional deterrence capabilities and weakening its proxy network. The war's aftermath would leave Iran reeling, not only in the sense of, militarily, but also in terms of morale. Its public confidence was shaken as the regime's core narrative of resistance was shown to be really more of a speed bump than anything else. It didn't seem to actually be capable of much. Iran's support for Russia during the Ukraine war also proved to be a poor investment, because while Iran would supply combat drones to Russia and received economic goods in return, analysts warned that Russia would likely abandon Iran under international pressure if a Ukraine ceasefire were reached in 2026, or that, at least with how the war had gone, it would be unable to do anything to support its regional ally, as all its attention was spent on its own conflict. In other words, should anything happen, Iran would basically be on its own, except for the couple key proxies that it still had that hadn't been destroyed by Israel. And we saw how that kind of played out here. Eventually, the economic and political misery would finally boil over. Beginning on December 28, 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests would erupt across Iran, spurred by the deteriorating economy, rising inflation, and the collapse of the rial, as we've already mentioned here. Now, these protests would quickly become the largest in scale since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and we did a whole video about them. They would spread to over 100 cities across the country and encompass all 31 of Iran's provinces. What is so unique about these protests, though, is that unlike earlier protest waves, these included widespread and very explicit calls for regime change internally. And when I say regime change, I'm not talking about a simple vote. We're talking about people calling for the death of the supreme theocratic leader, and not just for relief from them, but freedom. The response from the Iranian government? Well, as you can likely imagine, they were less than receptive. The Iranian government would respond with extreme violence, utilizing live ammunition to fire directly into crowds of protesters. And as a result, the death toll was absolutely staggering. It is estimated that anywhere between 3,000 people, if you're using the Iranian government's own figures, which is extremely low considering the hospital records that would come out later, to upwards of 36,500 people getting killed, making these some of the largest massacres in all of modern Iranian history, and even in terms of history or riot, protest history, anything along those lines, this is really bad. At the same time that this was happening, the government also imposed a sweeping internet blackout, which it framed as a cybersecurity defense against Israeli attacks. Observers, though, noted the economic damage of the blackout was estimated at $1.5 million per hour, as pretty much every business within Iran that was already struggling just crashed and burned. And it forced the population into the air-gapped National Information Network that was controlled directly by the state. So, yeah, not really a great solution. As time went on, the crisis began producing cracks within the state apparatus itself. In January of 2026, a senior official at Iran's permanent mission to the UN, Alireza Jirani Hokmabad, would request asylum from Switzerland, citing fear of social upheaval in Iran. And that upheaval is something that would continue in waves until largely, finally, being crushed by January 16th. Something that really horrified the international community, and that, my friends, after we've moved through it this quickly, is where we need to start talking about the United States, President Trump, and his words and actions. You see, since the beginning of the protests, Trump threatened on several occasions that the US would intervene in Iran and warned the regime against violent suppression. On January 12, 2026, he warned Iran's leaders that, quote, the United States would attack if security forces opened fire on protesters, end quote. And that same day, as Tehran said it was keeping communication channels with Washington open, Trump said the US may meet Iranian officials and that he was, quote, in contact with Iran's opposition, end quote. Now, of course, when it is that I say that, opposition in this case is a much looser term, as there technically is no formal opposition to the theocratic regime, as it stamped all that out quite a while ago and has continued to crush any possible resistance that could form. But again, if you saw my previous video, we mentioned how the son of the deposed Shah has been very vocal about leading the opposition, so that has been fascinating. But as it was, on the 13th of January 2026, Trump made easily his most direct statements, saying, and I quote, if protesters were executed by Iranian authorities, we will take very strong action, end quote. And that also, quote, help is on its way, end quote. He would cite economic action as being one component of the response, which doesn't necessarily seem like that would necessarily do all that much here in this case. But on the same day that this was said, Trump also wrote that he had, quote, canceled all meetings with the Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops, end quote. Things were being said and done. In addition to all this, Trump also stated that Iran had reached out to the United States to negotiate its nuclear program following his threats to strike. But really, when it is that I'm talking about this, the part where I said the help is on the way thing, that is the most crucial aspect of this entire story. Because really, one would probably expect that strikes would be underway in a matter of days after such statements. But that's not how reality works. Reality is a very different thing. Those on the ground in Iran were disappointed, to put it mildly, when no such help immediately materialized. But that is not something that is possible so quickly, considering just how much strength Iran was capable of utilizing. Forces would have to be prepared, and the Trump administration likely hoped that protesters would hold out for a couple more weeks for things to be in place. But again, that didn't really happen. The Iranian regime was cracking down hard, likely trying to stamp out any such protest movements before it could come under potential attack and find itself further weakened. As the crackdown on protesters escalated in early January, the US began repositioning military assets in the region. First up, the USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, which had already been deployed to the Middle East, was kept on station rather than rotating home. Alongside this, additional fighter squadrons were deployed to bases in the Gulf states, including Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE. And when I talk about that, here's something that I need to explain, because some people may be confused as to why forces were over in this area in the first place. And the answer is it goes back to October 7th. Following the October 7th, 2023 attacks, the US would continuously station at least one aircraft carrier in the Middle East or Eastern Mediterranean as things started to get particularly dicey. In fact, at the start of President Donald Trump's second term, 2 carriers operated in the region as American forces would conduct air and naval strikes against Houthi forces during Operation Rough Rider. Now, this presence would briefly diminish in late 2025 when the USS Gerald R. Ford was redeployed to the Caribbean for Operation Southern Spear, but still, by January 2026, the US naval buildup was described as the largest such presence in the region since the 2023 crisis began. And that was just the beginning. Mid-January 2026 saw the USS Abraham Lincoln ordered to the area, arriving on January 26th with its complete strike group. This deployment would include guided missile destroyers, cruisers, support vessels, and an air wing featuring FA-18E Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, E-2 Hawkeyes, MH-60 helicopters, and F-35C Lightning IIs. Things were getting spicier, and a lot of American hardware was moving into the region. That normally doesn't mean that nothing is going to happen. The regional U.S. naval presence was further bolstered by warships stationed in the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and Mediterranean, along with littoral combat ships operating in the Persian Gulf. Air power was reinforced with F-15E Strike Eagles and other fighters that were relocated from RAF Lankenheath to, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this here, Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. Allied forces, including Royal Air Force Eurofighter Typhoons, were also positioned at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And the thing is, my friends, as it is that I'm describing all of this during this time, negotiations were still technically underway. And there was not necessarily any confirmation that strikes were guaranteed to take place yet. Despite that, though, throughout February 2026, U.S. officials would indicate plans for expanding carrier operations. Media outlets like Wall Street Journal would report preparations for deploying the USS George H.W. Bush, which was conducting drills off of Virginia's coast, with hints that additional carriers might follow to reinforce ongoing operations. And more indeed was coming. By February 13, 2026, sources would confirm that the USS Gerald R. Ford was en route to the Middle East. Multiple reports would characterize this concentration of U.S. air and naval assets as one of the most significant regional force concentrations since the 2003 Iraq invasion. Which is true. It absolutely is. The Ford's arrival with its strike group would mark the largest naval deployment to the region since 5 carrier battle groups had assembled at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. That is not something that just, happens as a simple show of force with no teeth. If negotiations broke down, strikes could begin immediately and with overwhelming force. Following this, on February 24, 2026, reports would emerge of 12 F-22 fighter jets being deployed to Ovda Air Base in southern Israel, which had available hardened aircraft shelters. Interestingly enough, as a side note, this represented the first U.S. deployment of offensive weaponry to Israel. As for the other Gulf Arab allies of the United States, previous reports had indicated that they had blocked the U.S. from using their bases and airspace for strikes on Iran due to retaliation fears. Many of these states were strongly focused on negotiation and neutrality, hoping to avoid a conflict from breaking out, and admittedly, my friends, they tried their absolute hardest in this endeavor. They really did. But you may have already seen how that went, and I will be explaining that here later. Either way, February 26th would bring reports that the U.S. fleet headquarters in Bahrain had been reduced to fewer than 100 mission-critical personnel, with satellite imagery showing all U.S.-based ships had departed Bahrain port. Both measures had been implemented as defensive precautions in 2025, just prior to U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. That, right there, should probably be one of the strongest indications that something was going to go down, or at least it was fully prepared to. That next day, February 27th, the USS Gerald R. Ford was operating off of Israel's coast. The number of U.S. Air Force refueling tankers at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport was increased to 14, providing the Ford's carrier air wing with sufficient range to reach Iranian targets. And those targets would indeed be reached, because the following day, on February 28th, 2026, that is when all hell would finally break loose. Now, my friends, at the time that I am recording this episode on the now very early morning hours of March 5th, 2026, like literally I'm in Eastern time zone here and it's just past midnight, so yeah, I waited a long time to make this thing. The information that I am presenting to you is what it is that I could find to the best of my ability and verify. Some of these things may be different at a later date, and if that is the case, I am sorry. I specifically waited almost a week to get a handle on what was going on to make sure that I don't screw anything up when it is that I am talking about things. Right now, there is a lot of misinformation, both accidental and on purpose, floating around, confusing everyone and everything. So please, I'm telling you this right now, try to be patient. I promise you there will be many more follow-up videos explaining different aspects of the conflict. I just wanted to get that out of the way. With that being said, let's get into the thick of it. This, my friends, is Operation Epic Fury. On February 27th at 3:38 p.m. Eastern Time, or 20:38 GMT, the U.S. Central Command would receive the final go order from President Donald Trump. Quote, Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck. End quote. From this point, U.S. forces made final preparations. Air defense batteries had their systems checked to respond to Iranian attacks. Pilots and crews were rehearsing strike packages for their final time. Air crews were loading their final weapons into place, and two carrier strike groups began to move towards launching points. There was no turning back now. The first open moves were made by U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. Space Command, which would work to disrupt, degrade, and blind Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond before the attack began. And from this, with the Iranians effectively blinded, the real hits then began to fall. On February 28th at 1:15 a.m. Eastern Time, or 6:15 GMT, 9:45 a.m. Iranian time, more than 100 aircraft from land and sea were launched, forming what was called a, quote, single synchronized wave, end quote. The daylight strike was something that was based on a trigger event conducted by Israeli Defense Forces, enabled by U.S. intelligence services. Now, this is something that was an apparent reference to Israel's surprise attack on Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that was aided by U.S. intelligence. The first shots fired were Tomahawk missiles sent by the U.S. Navy, while the on-ground forces would fire precision standoff weapons. The attacks would strike more than 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours. Targets that included missile infrastructure, military sites, IRGC facilities, nuclear-related sites, and leadership compounds in Tehran and across the country, including potentially some other targets that, at the time that I'm making this here, have still yet to be confirmed, but there is a report that a girls' school was hit, though it is not confirmed whether this was from a US or Israeli strike, or whether this is one of the failed Iranian missiles that was fired and then fell down onto its own cities, as has happened multiple times. We don't really know yet. Within that time frame, though, initially denied by the Iranian state media, the supreme theocratic leader and much of the upper levels of the Iranian government were dead. Like, just to give you an idea on how severe this was, how rapid this was, allow me to just list a few of the names that we have available that were taken out. You have, again, from the top, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was killed. You have the Minister of Defense, Aziz Nasirzadeh. You have IRGC Commander, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, its commander, Mohammad Pakpour. You have the Chief of Staff, Abdolrahim Mousavi. You have the Secretary of Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani. You have the head of the military office of the Supreme Leader, Mohammad Shirazi. That is only just a few of the names of the people that we could potentially mention here. CBS News would go and report that 40 Iranian officials were killed in the strikes, though it was unclear whether or not they were in one location or multiple locations. We're not necessarily quite sure here yet. But either way, almost the entirety of the upper levels of the Iranian government were gone, just like that, in the first 24 hours. As news of Khamenei's death would break, videos circulated of people celebrating in Karaj, Kazvin, Shiraz, Kermanshah, Isfahan, and Sanandaj. All over the country, people were celebrating despite an internet blackout. As all of this was going on March 1st, a crowd in southern Iran would go and topple a monument to the Islamic Republic's founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. But when I say this here, my friends, I don't want to give you the idea that everyone across the country was celebrating, because that absolutely was not the case. State media from Iran would go and showcase videos of crowds of pro-government supporters gathering in squares all across the country, shouting for revenge and death to America and death to Israel and a whole host of other things. It very quickly became quite messy. But also, even as it is that I say that, I need to stress here, my friends, it was not just the US and Israel that were going to be struck back at. Oh, no. This is where perhaps Iran made a terrible miscalculation that we will likely need to address in a whole other video dedicated to just that. But to explain, Iran's response to the strikes was to escalate across the entire region, not just against American infrastructure, against everyone. Iranian missiles and drone attacks led to explosions in Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries where the US has military bases, but it was not just military targets that were being focused on. While Iranian leaders said the attacks targeted US assets, they also struck a lot of civilian infrastructure, including Dubai's international airport and a bunch of like 5-star hotels. Which, okay, pause. Before I move on, I have to address this part. On February 28, 2026, Iran carried out retaliatory drone strikes targeting multiple sites in the UAE. Debris near the Fairmont luxury 5-star hotel would injure 4 people, though defense systems largely intercepted most strikes. Videos would circulate on social media showing smoke trailing across the sky, and a fire was also reported. Officials would confirm there was no significant damage though, and from that, things were okay. The funniest part about this, and why it is that I wanted to really focus on, is that tourists ended up turning the entire incident of, wow, we're getting bombed by Iranian missiles, into a joke. They teased in hotel reviews, like Google reviews and all this, that, yes, my 5-star hotel lacks air defense systems. Therefore, I can't give it a high review. I'm only going to give it 1 or 2 stars. I say in all seriousness, they did it as a joke, even when this crisis was unfolding, and just really humanity never changes, and there is something darkly beautiful and funny about that. Either way, in addition to the Fairmont, other buildings were targeted, including the Burj Khalifa itself, the tallest building in the world, which luckily that was okay, and also the Burj Al Arab Hotel, which is another very famous 5-star luxury hotel that was hit, which really does showcase how nowhere was really safe. Even in places that had actively been declaring their neutrality and trying to make sure that the US did not attack Iran, which, that last part, that is where the miscalculation on Iran's part gets particularly bad. Because, as I've kind of shown here, Iran began targeting energy infrastructure. Because, as I've already explained, in addition to the civilian infrastructure, Iran also began to target energy infrastructure in Gulf countries, likely to impose an economic cost and also try to force the US and its partners to pursue a ceasefire before achieving regime change. They wanted all of these varying different Gulf states to come together and be like, hey US, stop doing this. We are getting bombed. We really need you to stop so that we can start making money again. You know, something like that. The US Embassy in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia was also hit by drones, and Iran threatened to set fire to any ship that was trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, effectively threatening to close off the world's most critical oil choke point. From here, over 11,000 flights to and from the region were canceled, and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman would identify the attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities as a red line, with the UAE going in warning that it was not going to sit cross-armed. It was not going to sit there and do nothing. This is just it, my friends. This is where the miscalculation comes in. Instead of making neutral forces turn against the US to push for peace, to not make things worse, the Iranians ironically drove them right into the arms of Washington after flagrantly violating their neutrality and deliberately attacking their civilian infrastructure. And if there's one thing you don't really want to mess with when it comes to the Middle East, is you don't touch their oil, in the same way as you don't touch America's boats. Either way though, the attacks would continue. And by the end of March 1st, the first 6 US fatalities were confirmed after Camp Arifjan in Kuwait was struck. It was not just Iran that was getting hit. It's just the effects were significantly more lopsided in this case. Also, at the same time that I say that here, my friends, I understand that we are jumping around quite a bit, and so I need to list out what happened starting from March 2nd. What I will be listing here may seem a bit out of place at times, but it's because so many things were happening in so many different places all at the same time that it's really hard to follow, because I could be talking about one thing that is taking place in southern Iran, and then the next thing we're going to be going all the way over to Saudi Arabia, then Kuwait, then Jordan, then Israel, then back to Iran again. It's all over. So I tried to group this up here as much as it is that I could. First up, Khamenei's wife, Mansoura, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the rest of her name because I know I'm going to butcher that here in the first place, but we'll put it up here. She was confirmed dead from injuries that had been sustained on the February 28th strikes. Along with that, Iran would go and attack the US Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, as I said, and Iranian drones would strike the US Embassy in Kuwait, which was closed until further notice, and more Iranian drones would strike luxury hotels on Dubai's Palm Jumeirah and would ignite fires at Jebel Ali Port, which is one of the region's most critical commercial hubs. From there, the UAE would close its embassy in Tehran and begin considering military action. Alongside that, Iranian drones would strike the Ras Tanura oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest, forcing a partial shutdown. A senior IRGC official would threaten to, and I quote, set fire to any ship sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, declaring no oil would leave the area. I know I mentioned that in the previous section here before, but this is the actual timeline of when this is happening. And as all of that is happening, Hezbollah would decide to take advantage and enter the war on Iran's side, launching missiles and drones at Israel from Lebanon, breaking the ceasefire that had been in place since November of 2024. Iran would also launch at least 6 missile barrages at Israel during this time. And it is here, then, at this point, that we need to mention that when questioned about how long operations were going to last, that President Trump said military action was projected to last, and I quote, 4 to 5 weeks, but we have the capability to go far longer than that, end quote. So that is the time frame that we are currently looking at here. In addition, Trump stated that he had not ruled out boots on the ground in Iran, but he repeatedly called for the Iranians to rise up against their government, that they would never get another chance like this again. And that part is true, and it's probably the most crucial aspect about this. But a lot more things have to happen first. Next up, March 3rd, 2026, day 4 of the conflict. The massive scale of the operation really starts to become a bit more clear. By this point, the US had struck over 1,700 Iranian targets since February 28th, with CENTCOM confirming that B-52 strategic bombers were in operation. As for Israel's actions, the Israeli Air Force would announce that it had conducted 1,600 sorties into Iranian territory and dropped over 4,000 munitions on Iranian targets, matching the total from the previous entire 12-day war in just a fraction of the time. From all this, the IAF would strike an Iranian military complex in eastern Tehran, and the IDF would claim that it destroyed a covert nuclear site. In one example of the action that we're talking about here, video footage would emerge showing the IRGC Malek Ashtar building in Tehran completely destroyed and wiped out. Besides all of that, something of note here that I do want to mention because it's also pretty important here as a just historical, not breakthrough, that's not the right term, but just a thing of historical significance, is that an IDF F-35I Adir would shoot down a Russian-made Iranian Yak-130 fighter jet over Tehran, which is the first time in history that a stealth fighter has shot down a manned fighter jet in combat. So, again, a lot of things are happening from this conflict here that are making history, and that is interesting to me. But the Iranians were not just going to not respond. Iran would continue to launch ballistic missile barrages at Israel, including one with cluster munition warheads that landed near Tel Aviv, injuring at least 12 people. In fact, since February 28th, Iranian ballistic missiles had killed at least 11 people and injured over 1,000 in Israel. Though, what is interesting to note here is that Iran has actually launched a greater number of drones at neutral Arab Gulf states rather than at Israel, exploiting the shorter flight distance. Bahrain alone has reported intercepting 74 missiles and 92 drones since February 28th, and the UAE has absorbed some 800 projectiles from Iran since the war began, and hell, likely at the time that I'm saying this in the first place, that number has grown, but that is because it's something that is constantly changing. As for how things are going within Iran, well, the situation is obviously not pretty, but details on the ground are murky at best. The regime, of course, has maintained a nationwide internet blackout to limit its citizens' ability to mobilize and prevent as much of the word of catastrophic losses leaking to the public as possible. To further shore up internal security, Iranian security forces have set up checkpoints on major highways in Tehran, and the regime has sent intimidating messages to Iranian journalists to prevent them from spreading information about the war, as this is something that could then galvanize people to turn on the government once again. And so really, they can't get all that much information. But we here do actually have more information. And heading into March 4th, which is the day before that I'm recording this video and at the time that I was writing and trying to get all this ready for this in the first place, things got very interesting indeed. Like literally at the time that I am writing this thing, I am constantly checking the updates to see if anything is popping up as I am going, because I can never tell if what it is that I am putting in is going to end up being irrelevant by the end. So I had to keep a close eye on it. First up, from this, March 4th, big historical news, again, just like the fighter jet issue. A US submarine sank the Iranian warship, the IRIS Dena, off the coast of Gal, Sri Lanka. Or Gale? Gale? They sank it off the coast of Sri Lanka, essentially. This is thousands of miles from the war zone, mind you, and it killed 87 crewmen that were on it. This frigate was returning from International Fleet Review 2026 in India, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that this was the first time a US submarine had fired a torpedo at a ship since World War II. That is history right there. This is among 20 Iranian ships the US has reportedly taken out at this point, basically dismantling Iran's limited navy as it was. So yeah, that's a pretty big deal. But also, as this happened, NATO went and downed an Iranian missile fired towards Turkey that had flown over Iraq and Syria before being intercepted over the eastern Mediterranean. And that is extremely worrisome. There is a very real chance that after actions targeting British, French, and now Turkish assets, along with the Gulf state civilian infrastructure, that far more countries are going to be drawn into this conflict than initially anticipated. And now it seems that even the stateless could be involved. The Kurds could get in on this. Yes, you heard me right. While indeed it is true that calls were made for local Iranians to rise up, they appear to not be the only ones that have heeded the call. Reports have emerged that a Kurdish armed uprising inside western Iran could begin at the time that I'm making this literally within days. Who knows, it might even pop up by the time that this video actually comes out. According to the Daily Mail, which take that with a grain of salt as you would have it, the US has been secretly arming thousands of Kurdish volunteers in western Iran since 2024, stockpiling weapons for a potential ground rebellion. To put this into perspective, 6 days before this conflict began, 5 dissident Kurdish Iranian groups sheltering in Iraq announced the formation of the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan to fight Iran. These Kurdish factions have thousands of soldiers along the Iran-Iraq border and control strategic areas. In recent weeks, the Kurdish Iranian faction sent hundreds of their members from the camp on the Iraqi side of the border to the Iranian side as part of a preparation for possible attack against regime forces. And now, US and Israeli strikes have been specifically targeting western Iran to destabilize the region ahead of a possible on-ground Kurdish offensive. Which, there's no promises on that, but if that actually happens, oh boy, things are going to get much messier, much faster. The big question now that many people probably have is what exactly is going to happen next? And the short answer is we have no freaking idea. But I will say I have been calling something like this happening for the last year at this point. I feel somewhat vindicated. I also feel somewhat guilty because I traveled and then it happened while I was in South Carolina at a LARPing event. But yeah, either way though, the other concern that many people have when talking about this conflict, whether you are a senator, an analyst, or whether a citizen on the ground, is that this US war in Iran is depleting stocks of sophisticated and valuable weapon systems that protect American bases, ships, and allies around the globe from missile attacks rather rapidly. In fact, to the point that Iran's stockpiles vastly seem to outnumber the US's own. Iran has been producing vast quantities of missiles and other munitions to make huge stockpiles in case of attack, and has been a large provider for the Russians due to their war in Ukraine. Senior US officials have acknowledged that yes, this is a problem. This is something that definitely is there and it is a problem, but there is also a key answer to this. The answer is that it does not matter how many missiles you have if the launchers that actually send them towards the enemy don't exist anymore. Bullets are, after all, fairly useless if there is no gun to fire them in the first place. To that end, both the United States and Israel have been deliberately targeting the weapon and defensive systems of Iran. Its launchers, its hangars, anything that actually allows its weapons to be used has been targeted. General Dan Kane, the top US military officer, would say Wednesday, March 4th, at the Pentagon that, quote, Iran's theater ballistic missile shots fired are down 86% from the first day of fighting, with a 23% decrease just in the last 24 hours. Their one-way attack drone shots are down 73% from the opening days, end quote. To clarify the numbers that we're talking about here, General Kane put the number of weapons fired by Iran at more than 500 ballistic missiles and more than 2,000 drones, which, for anyone trying to deal with this, is a major air defense challenge. And from that, experts and citizens alike have raised concerns about stocks of US and allies' air defense interceptors and other munitions, especially after so many were sold or given to Ukraine. But both Kane and Hesketh would indicate that American forces have enough, with Kane saying, and I quote, "We have sufficient precision munitions for the task at hand, both on the offense and the defense," end quote. While Hesketh would say the difference between, quote, "their ability to shoot versus our ability to defend is wider and wider every day," end quote. So by destroying Iran's ability to respond, it doesn't matter if they have huge stockpiles of missiles because they'll have nothing to actually fire them with. As for what is going to happen next after that, then, again, who can really say? Senate Republicans have blocked a war powers measure by Democrats that would have limited Trump's authority to continue strikes, so there is nothing changing on the political home front. And now, both Australia and Canada are offering tentative support to the United States. To quote some of the news articles that are talking about this, which, again, this is very recent at the time that I'm making this on the early morning hours of March 5th, the leaders of Canada and Australia have urged a de-escalation of broader hostilities in the Middle East, while also stressing the need to end Iran's nuclear weapons program. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, would present a united front as middle powers in a joint press briefing in Canberra on Thursday, March 5th. Carney would say that Canada was not going to participate in the US military action in Iran, but when he was pressed by journalists as to whether he would rule it out, even if the conflict broadens, he did say that anything was possible. With this being the quote here, "You've asked a fundamental hypothetical in a conflict that can spread very broadly. Today's events or recent events point to that. So one can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies." End quote. Which, wow, that was probably not something that many people necessarily expected. But that, my friends, is where it is that we are right now. Of course, rest assured that there will be a lot more videos that are going to be coming out about this. Why China and Russia went and abandoned Iran, more updates on the conflict, and really just about anything else that we can answer that you ask in the comments section. In fact, I'll probably be creating a bunch of shorts talking about this and Iranian and US military technology and all the different stuff that is being used and done. There's so much that is going on, and really this is the sum of the curse of may you live in interesting times. 2026 is absolutely the sum of that. If 2025 was the preparatory stages, this is the full-blown experience, and we will see how things go from here. Again, thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, support this channel. And also, I will say this, if you want more just pure history content, then make sure to go and check out my History Hose page, which I'm going to leave a link for down below, since I cover a lot more geopolitics here. And if you want to support me on Patreon, I'll greatly appreciate it, because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about here is likely to get demonetized, which really hurts both me, my editor, my family, all kinds of stuff. So if you want to support me, again, that is very appreciated. Thank you all very much for watching, my friends. I'll see you all next time, and goodbye.